So yeah, I'm going to argue that agreement is its own incentive. Now the reason all of us are attending this conference is that we're all excited about blockchain, right? But why is it? What are the things about blockchain that make it so exciting and different? Really, it boils down to three things that were not possible before blockchain or seemed impossible that we can now do. And the first, and the one that's obviously attracted the most attention, is coin distribution. Blockchain has shown that it's possible to create some new cryptocurrency out of thin air, distribute it in such a way that there's a limited supply, but people believe it has value, right? 15 years ago, that sounded crazy, but look what's happened since then. The second thing that's so exciting about blockchain is the fact that you can have censorship-resistant transaction submission. So if you build your business on top of, let's say, Facebook or Apple or Amazon, you may, if you're very successful, you may run into a problem where the company you built on comes to you and says, that's a pretty nice business you just built there. How about you give us a larger share of the profits, or we're going to shut you down, right? And then you're kind of at the mercy of this larger player, and they may shut you down. So that can never happen to you if you build on blockchain, because of the fact that the blockchain is not administered by any central entity, right? So even if they're miners, and one miner has it in for you, eventually some other miner will include your transactions, say, in the Bitcoin blockchain if you're using Bitcoin. Now, the third thing that's really remarkable about blockchain, and I think the thing that we've only begun to scratch the surface of, is that blockchains allow you to commit irreversible transactions securely across unknown or mutually distrustful parties. And this is absolutely huge, right? Because it means that basically anybody with a text editor can build and deploy products and services that previously you would have had to set up some really difficult to negotiate bespoke agreement with a trusted intermediary, right? But you get the trusted intermediary out of the way, and you basically have this self-serve financial infrastructure where anybody can implement things who has an idea. And the result of that has been kind of this enormous multiplier effect on the pace of fintech innovation, right? Look at everything that's happened in the past 10 or 15 years, all because of blockchain, right? So if you're going to build a blockchain, then for robustness, you need to replicate the blockchain, or at the very least the ledger resulting from that blockchain, on many computers around the world that are run by different people, right? And in order to do this, you usually need a consensus protocol in order to make sure that all these machines agree, all these replicas agree on the set of transactions that has been executed, and usually you also need to know the order in which they've been executed. So consensus protocols have long been studied in the field of distributed systems. We've known about them for decades. Blockchains kind of added a new twist to this, and that they kind of introduced and popularized this idea of incentive-based consensus, right? So we've all heard of proof of work and proof of stake. What these things boil down to is basically that you grant new, or not new or old, cryptocurrency to parties who basically take actions to make the consensus more secure and thus make everybody's transactions harder to reverse, right? And so why were proof of work and proof of stake so exciting? Well, because they let anybody participate, usually anonymously, in administering the ledger, right? And the fact that there's this kind of open membership of the set of people administrating the ledger gives you this censorship-resistant property. Again, even if one miner has it in for you and doesn't want your Bitcoin transaction to go in, eventually someone else will mine a block, and they'll include your transaction, especially if you have a fee that you pay there. And the final thing is that incentives turn out to be the ideal mechanism for coin distribution, right? We need to get all the Bitcoins out there in the first place, and how do you do that? Well, mining rewards, right? So that worked perfectly to solve the coin distribution problem. However, what I'm going to argue in this talk is that works fine for cryptocurrency, but for many tokens, you're actually better served by what we now call proof of agreement than by either proof of work or proof of stake. And specifically, I'm arguing that proof of work and proof of stake are ill-suited for issuer-backed tokens. And what do I mean by issuer-backed tokens? That's any token whose value derives from some kind of promise that somebody's made in the real world outside of the blockchain. So this would include, for example, a cash-backed stablecoin, right? It has value because someone has promised to give you cash in exchange for redeeming the token. So it would apply to loyalty points. It would apply to any kind of tokenized security, carbon credits, all these things that the token is representing something in the real world. We just had, like literally before my talk, Block Time Financial just issued a preferred stock offering on Stellar, right? So that's what I would call an issuer-backed security. There's obviously a company that's issuing that preferred stock. Okay, so why are proof of work and proof of stake not well suited for issuer-backed tokens? Well, the problem is you kind of are in this Goldilocks situation where if your token transactions are too valuable, you'll actually have insufficient security, right? Because you're doing these high value transactions and you're not paying enough incentive to keep these anonymous validators and miners honest. And conversely, if your token transactions are not valuable enough, if you're trying to send 50 cents to Mexico, then you're going to pay excessive fees, right? Because someone's got to pay these incentives, right? Either you pay them directly as a transaction fee, or you pay them indirectly through inflation because you're creating new cryptocurrency out of thin air. So you might say, like, well, what about, so let's take a really high quality blockchain like Ethereum, right? Ethereum has probably $20 billion staked. So that means that, once you have $7 to $10 billion, you could start seriously messing with the Ethereum blockchain if you're willing to lose that money. But maybe you can lever up and borrow a bunch of ETH to mess with it. So, you could probably start seriously messing with the Ethereum blockchain if you're willing to burn $2 or $3 billion, right? Sounds like a lot of money. But now suppose you're a central bank and you're thinking of issuing a digital currency, and you think, well, if this is successful, I'm going to have trillions of dollars of currency out there and maybe $1 trillion a day in volume. Suddenly these incentives don't look adequate to do that, right? It's not sort of sustainable as you gain success and as the value of the token starts to significantly exceed the value of the underlying cryptocurrency that's being used to pay these incentives. Now, another kind of limitation of proof of work and proof of stake is they kind of fail to leverage a lot of investment that we've made kind of as a society in reaching human agreement, right? So we've kind of all got all these mechanisms in our society to agree on things like ownership or enforcement of legal contracts. We have all this regulation that we put in place to make sure that our banks stay solvent and that they can't just run away with our money. And all this is extremely useful for making the economy run, but you're kind of not really leveraging any of it with proof of work and proof of stake. And sort of a final really scary thing is imagine that you issue say $1 billion worth of tokens, say a cash-backed US dollar stablecoin, and there's a failure of human agreement that leads to a fork in the blockchain, right? Well, you can duplicate the cryptocurrency when you fork a blockchain, and so you can duplicate the claims, these digital dollar tokens, but you can't duplicate the underlying dollars, right? So you're now in a situation where you could potentially, in the worst case, face $2 billion of redemptions for having issued only $1 billion of cashback coins. So what this means, it doesn't mean that, proof of work and proof of stake are bad for all uses, but what it does mean is that all blockchains on some level require human agreement, right? The blockchain is not useful unless kind of humans agree on what consensus protocol the blockchain uses, what the parameters are for that consensus protocol, what transactions are and are not valid on this blockchain, what the semantics are of those transactions. And so kind of some examples where people needed to agree on this. In 2016, there was a hack of the Ethereum DAO contract led to something like $50 million worth of ETH being stolen. And about 85% of the Ethereum miners said, well, we think this is really unfortunate. And so we want to change the rules. We're going to change the semantics of transactions to allow this weird one-time irregular state change that's essentially going to undo this hack, right? So that people can recover these funds, right? And the other 15% of miners said, wait a sec, it sucks that this money was stolen, but the rules are the rules, and you shouldn't make them up as you go along, right? So these are both reasonable positions. And fortunately, the Ethereum community actually handled this really well, right? So what happened was there was a fork, but everybody kind of agreed that the new rules would be called Ethereum, and the original rules became known as Ethereum Classic, right? And it's fortunate that everybody kind of agreed that the name Ethereum would apply to this new set of rules. More recently, and less catastrophically, Ethereum switched from proof of work to proof of stake, this event I'm sure everybody's heard of called the merge. And again, there are some miners, there's this thing called Ethereum POW. It's pretty fringe, but it exists, or ETHW. But everybody agrees that what we call Ethereum is actually the proof of stake now, and the old thing is called ETHW. Right? Now, the point is that no matter what your consensus algorithm you have underlying the blockchain, it's useless unless you have kind of human agreement on these higher level parameters, right? So imagine that, for example, Coinbase and Binance did not agree on whether the merge happened, right? So one of the companies thinks that Ethereum is Ethereum, and the other one is actually using the name Ethereum to describe Ethereum POW, right? This would be catastrophic, right? You'd have someone would try to move USDC from Coinbase to Binance, and then the money would disappear, right? Because it would move on one blockchain, but not on it would disappear on one blockchain, but not appear on the other blockchain, right? And of course, what would happen is it would completely shatter confidence in the credibility of this industry, and both companies would lose a huge amount of money, right? So there's this strong incentive for everybody to agree on the rules, because otherwise everybody is going to suffer. But the point is that in most cases, this human agreement it's not really formalized, right? And I mean, you might say oh, but sure it's formalized. Look on ethereum.org, there's this document called EIP 3675, and it says how we're going to switch from proof of work to proof of stake, et cetera. But of course, suppose whoever is hosting ethereum.org loses their mind and starts tampering with that document, or GitHub starts changing the implementation when people aren't pushing commits or something, tampering with the Git repositories, everybody would say, okay, wait a second, we thought ethereum.org was authoritative, but clearly they've lost their mind. Ethereum really is the proof of stake thing, right? So there's this underlying sort of human level agreement that backstops whatever craziness might happen there. It just isn't formalized. To take another example, maybe a more forward-looking example, suppose you want to embrace the future and put your apartment lease on a blockchain, right? So this sounds very cool. When somebody breaks into your apartment, you're still going to need to, call the police or call the building manager and argue, well, no, I'm the rightful occupant of this apartment. This person is a squatter, right? And so you still need society to agree that you're the rightful occupant of this apartment, and that might actually come down to some legal document that you sign, pen on paper, saying we will follow the Ethereum blockchain for occupancy of this apartment, and you'll be backstopped by the courts and the police and whatever. So my thesis here is that for many of these interesting uses of blockchain, you kind of need human level agreement anyway, right? And so why not leverage that human level agreement as the basis of your consensus protocol, right? And this is what we're calling proof of agreement, right? And the point is you can do this without really increasing your attack surface, because you're already kind of trusting this other human level agreement to kind of make sure that the blockchain is respected when it comes to kind of real world property rights, for example. There's one huge caveat here, which is that this doesn't work if you need coin distribution, right? So we're not trying to replace Bitcoin here. We're trying to provide a better way to create issuer-backed tokens, right? Of course, we still have the problem of coin distribution, and for that, well, it's messy, and we've already pushed a lot of lumens out, and it wasn't perfect, but at least it's been okay. And then, for example, we could do things like take shortcuts, at the 3 years ago at Meridian, we burned half the lumens, 50 billion lumens. We got half of the a bunch of lumens out there, and we think that we did an okay job. So let's just double our progress by just getting rid of half the lumens, right? And so eventually we're going to get there, and once the lumens are out there, right, it's just going to be much better for any kind of issuer-backed token to be based on proof of agreement, so we shouldn't kind of optimize for coin distribution. So how does Stellar work? Well, there's a Stellar consensus protocol that I designed that kind of underlines the network, and it's based on this idea of quorum slices. And the idea is that you have the validators in the system are not anonymous, right? They're run by known organizations, and each validator kind of advertises the set of organizations that it needs to agree with, right? So in this case, for example, we've got 3 validators, V2, V3, and V4. I don't know if I've got a laser pointer here up top. And they are saying, like, we will not agree to anything unless all 3 of us agree to something, right? And then maybe you have node V1 says, hey, I won't agree to anything unless V2 and V3 do. So that's kind of like the quorum slice for V1. And of course, V2 and V3 say, well, we won't agree to anything unless V4 does. So what that means is that by the time V1 reaches consensus on something and like decides that a block is valid, you're guaranteed that eventually V4 will as well. Obviously, the details of how the consensus protocol works are outside the scope of this talk, but you can look at, we had published a paper in the Symposium on Operating System Principles in 2019, and so that's a great resource for learning more about kind of really the technical underpinnings of the network. You can find that paper at stellar.org/SOSP19 if you want. So one advantage of this proof of agreement is this ultra low cost, right? There's no proof of work, there's no staking necessary, right? You just need to kind of do this protocol, which involves, each node computing a handful of digital signatures. So you get very cheap transactions, very low latency, and even more important, this protocol lets token issuers protect themselves from double redemption attacks, right? Let's say that you are this hypothetical central bank that eventually might want to create $1 trillion worth of, like CBDC on Stellar, right? That those tokens that you create, those CBDC tokens, they will have value because you are guaranteeing that they are base money or that you redeem them for some other kind of dollar, say, right? But the thing is, you don't just promise to redeem them for dollars. You say, hey, I'll redeem these digital tokens for dollars. And by the way, when I process those redemptions, I'm using this particular validator. So if you care about transactions in my token, and you probably should if my token is going to grow to be worth $1 trillion, you better put my validator in your quorum slice. But it's kind of up to individual people to decide how much they care about, agreeing with any particular token issuer. So let's just kind of run through an example of like how this might work in practice, and in particular why it's not subject to attack and will dissuade people from attacking the system. So let's say we have a more complicated setup where we have a hierarchical set of validators. So there's a kind of a top tier of validators, V1 to V4, and they all set their quorum slices to depend on like 3 out of the 4 top tier validators. And then below them, maybe there's this middle tier that depend on 2 out of the 4 top tier validators, and maybe there's kind of a leaf tier at the bottom. But what's nice is like the internet, there's no authority who's saying like you are a top tier validator. Like that just kind of arises out of market forces. So let's say that the market decides that the top 4 retail banks in the US are going to be like the top tier validators, right? This could happen if they all got on Stellar. Now the problem is like not everyone might agree with this, right? So V7 and V8 might say like, well, you know what? We are, we realize that like we can't get anywhere in this economy unless we agree with the big banks. But we also don't trust those big banks. We think they're going to try to rip us off the first chance they get, these evil banks. So that's fine. What you could do is V7 and V8 could go out and find some other organizations that they think have incentives that are not aligned with the banks, and organizations that are very unlikely to like collude with big banks to steal money. So let's pick 3 nonprofits like Stellar Development Foundation, EFF, and the ACLU, just hypothetically. And so V7 and V8 will say, hey, well, you know what? We're not going to accept anything as final unless like one of these nonprofits agrees. And then the nonprofits might say, hey, we're only going to agree to stuff if 2/3 of us plus 3/4 of the top tier ones agree, and so on. And so let's see why, if you have this configuration, the system is actually robust to attacks even from the top tier. So let's now presume that this paranoia was well-founded, and assuming like Citibank is going to try to do an attack. So Citibank goes to V7 and says, hey, V7, I'm going to send you $1 billion on Stellar, and I would like to walk out of your store immediately with $1 billion worth of goods, or maybe I want to fly away with this fleet of airplanes that I'm going to buy from you, right? And you should let me do this immediately because this is Stellar. We've got good, it's finality immediately, whatever, 5-second settlement time. So V7 says, well, I better make sure I'm part of a quorum that like really agrees on this. And so V7 is going to say, well, I need 2 out of these 4 top tier guys, and well, they need 3 out of 4, but okay, that's fine. 3 out of those guys will agree. And oh, wait a sec, I also need a nonprofit, so I'll go check with the EFF, and well, EFF needs 2 out of 3, so maybe Stellar needs to sign off. Okay, looks like we have a quorum. Like, I believe this transaction is final. Here's your fleet of airplanes, have a nice day, right? Citibank flies off with these airplanes. And now we're assuming Citibank's evil, right? So Citibank gets together with these other 2 banks and says, hey, let's pretend that $1 billion is actually still at Citibank and not with V7. And then Citibank goes to V8 and says, hey, V8, here's $1 billion, ha ha ha, let me have your fleet of airplanes. And so V8 will say, well, I need to make sure 2 out of these 4 top tier validators sign off on this. Well, sure, they'll sign off on it because they're evil. They're going to undo the transaction that sent the money to V7. And then V8's going to say, well, I also need one of these nonprofits, and maybe go, and the thing is, 2 out of these 3 guys, Stellar and EFF, know that this is not a valid transaction, right? They know that history has been tampered with. But maybe the ACLU was straggling and V8 gets unlucky and talks to the ACLU. The ACLU is going to say, well, this looks legitimate to me, but I'm not going to agree to this unless either Stellar or EFF does, right? And they aren't, and so that's going to block this transaction. And so the network's kind of going to maybe halt, or V8 is not going to ever see progress in the network, but it won't let Citibank fly away with this fleet of airplanes, right? Now, of course, if you look at the outcome here, well, not only did Citibank not steal the airplanes, but it's like signed, digitally signed contradictory messages that prove it's violating the protocol and trying to steal money. So probably, given that you won't get away with this and you'll get in trouble, probably the big banks would actually be dissuaded from trying to cheat in this way, right? So this is how this protocol works. All right. So obviously, if you're here at this conference, you know that Stellar's been around in production use with this Stellar Consensus Protocol since 2015. It's processed over 5 billion operations since then. There's this really cool website, stellarbeat.io, that shows the actual real graph of the dependencies between the validators. And you can see there's this kind of tight cluster of top tier validators. Again, there's, they happen to have agreement, but it's, it doesn't have to be. It might be that someday there isn't 100% agreement among tier 1 of who's exactly tier 1. This is much the way the internet works today, where you have tier 1 ISPs, but then occasionally they play chicken with each other and try to get each other to pay for transit. And following the goals that we had for this proof of agreement, the transaction fees are minuscule, right? And most transaction costs under 10 to the minus $5, right? Essentially nothing. Settlement is every 5 seconds, but that's just because we kick it off with a timer. In reality, the median time to reach consensus is under a second. And of course, the carbon footprint is much, much better than proof of work, which is sort of catastrophic from an energy consumption point of view. So, we've got some time left. Maybe this is a controversial position, but I'll take questions, or anybody who wants to, debate me on this. Here, let's wait for a microphone. So.
There are other, like Tezos or Solana. They claim they have other consensus. What do you think of them? Not proof of work, not stake, not agreements.
Well, I think you're talking about proof of history.
Yeah.
I mean, proof of history is, the way I view proof of history is it fixes one particular problem with proof of stake, but it's still a proof of stake, basically.
I want to ask you about the other job as a researcher. How much input or how few do you have from the Europe continent for your research? So are we participating actively into blockchain research and development?
Yes. I'm not sure. Yes, of course, there's people doing blockchain research in Europe.
But at your own research, do you have participants from this continent?
Me personally?
So sometimes I feel like Europe, we use crypto, but we are not developing that much.
So most of my research, so my day job is I'm a professor of computer science at Stanford. So, I spend 4 days a week at Stanford, and I spend, Thursdays at Stellar. So obviously my research is in the U.S. because I'm at Stanford working with Stanford students. But at Stellar, we certainly have employees who are around the world. So, I don't know if it's a criticism, like we should have like more employees in Europe or something like.
Yes, please. That would be great.
Maybe
Yes.
maybe that's a fair criticism. I'm not sure. I can't speak to our hiring processes.
Hey, so do you see it as an issue if there are economic incentives to run a validator because it creates validators that aren't necessarily driven to provide an accurate view of the ledger, but rather are monetarily driven?
Yeah, I think that if Stellar really succeeds, the value of, well, first of all, I guess we should ask like in what asset are the incentives?
So like I'm talking like MEV redistribution, like
about what? Sorry.
Like you have an advantage in on-chain arbitrage if you run a validator. Like is that do you see that as an issue?
So you're worried about essentially what we would call miner extractable value, except that there are no miners. Yeah, it is. It is a potential issue. Like I don't think that there's. I don't think that there's. I think what's going on right now is like because we're moving over to Sorbonne, this is going to change. I will say that if we were to continue to go with Stellar Classic, we actually I have a very brilliant student named Jeff Ramsayer at Stanford who actually figured out a brilliant way not only to make an on-chain DEX super scalable and parallelizable, but also to make it super fair because all the transactions in a block are like transaction independent. So if we were to, bring Stellar Classic to the next level, which is not where we currently have kind of engineering resources, but because we're concentrating on Sorbonne, then this is a problem we could solve. I think we'll have to see how it arises, what happens at Sorbonne. It is a potential issue, and we'll have to deal with it if it comes up. But again, we do things like we do randomize the kind of like pseudo-randomly permute transactions and stuff based on a hash. If it turns out that that's not good enough, like there are things you can do with like VDFs and stuff, or other ways that you can make it like difficult to predict the order in which transactions are going to be executed.
Yeah, like even with the randomization, you have an advantage because you essentially have mempool access. And you also have lower latency to get your transaction into a set. So
yeah,
I don't think the randomness will ever be sufficient, really.
Well, what you have to do is you have to make it dependent. You have to make the order dependent on something that you learn after you finalize the block, right?
Yeah.
So there are ways to do that, and like the brute force way would like add some more latency because you'd be using either a VDF or you maybe a VRF or something to have a bunch of validators like later create a VRF output. But so this could be something that becomes a problem, and if so, we will find ways to solve it. Like it's an annoying problem; it's not insurmountable.
Okay, got it.
Congratulations on being 7 years old. There we go. Congratulations on being 7 years old.
Thank you.
Quite the masterpiece. I have two questions. I think you can answer both at the same time, which is one, what motivates you to keep building? And two, what does success look like for Stellar in your vision?
Okay, thanks. Well, what motivates us to keep building, and me in particular, like why do I show up to work at Stellar? Well, it's all of you guys, right? There's nothing more gratifying for me than just like seeing like a whole ecosystem like built on top of things that like I care deeply about, like sort of equitable access to things. I've always hated systems where like I feel like I'm smarter than the person administering the system, and like I can't do stuff because quote unquote security, right? So the idea of having like a self-serve thing where like I don't need anyone's permission, like I can, any Stanford student should be able to access the same APIs as like Franklin Templeton or like some big established like company, right? Like I very much believe in that, and to like see a whole ecosystem based on an infrastructure that like kind of like has that value built into it baked into it at a very low level is very gratifying. And sorry, your second question was. So I think one cop out would be success looks like something that, you know, we haven't predicted yet, because like the whole point is it's open and people are going to innovate on it, right? And like Stellar is like a multiplicative factor on people's innovation, because now anybody can innovate instead of like a handful of, you know, software engineers at banks. You know, I think that there are a number of ways in which I could see the success. You know, I would love Stellar to become like almost like an international payment standard, for example. Like that would be amazing. You know, I would love to see, you know, super successful dApps built on top of Sorbonne. You know, I can't predict the future, but I can get individual scenarios that I get very excited about. So.
Yeah, so I guess one question with incentives is that you've shown that like agreement is positive and is a good incentive. But one thing is that to participate in this agreement costs money running a validator. And
Yeah.
so say that, how do you incentivize having more validators on the network, which would be healthy for the network? Because with Ethereum, the incentive to spin up a new node is because, oh, I can make money. But say, oh, SDF, I trust Lobster, the tier one validator is doing a good enough job. What's incentivizing new validator additions?
So, so what's interesting is like, so thank you for this question, because it actually points, there's almost this like false equivalence. Like people think of like, oh, running a Stellar validator, that's like running a Bitcoin miner, or it's like running an Ethereum validator, right? And that's actually not the case. Running a Stellar validator is more like running like a full node. Right? So there's no incentive payment for running like a Bitcoin full node. Why do you run a full node? Well, because it's convenient to have a local copy of the ledger, right? Or because you want to like help out the ecosystem, right? And the resources involved in running a Stellar validator, you know, other than like computing like whatever, maybe like 4 digital signatures or something whenever you're doing ledger close, are basically the same as running. They're more equivalent to, they're basically equivalent to like running a full node. So the second thing is that I think that you know, the reason why you might want to run a validator in addition to having a full node is because you are issuing a token and you're worried about double redemption attacks and you want to protect yourself, right? And so, so I think like people issuing very valuable tokens should either run want to run validators to protect themselves or contract with some trusted party. And I think that you know there's is Anthony here? You know there's definitely like I think you know. People working on things like Anchor in a Box, I think, where like, and if that involves sort of like validation service, like that would be great. So I like this model that like, you know, I don't care if like 80% of like people are using Gmail for email, as long as you don't have to, as long as like I implement like run my own SMTP mail server, right? Because I want something different, right? And just the fact that people can run something different actually provides an escape hatch that forces Google to like justify their existence and not charge like exorbitant rates. So, so even if not a lot of people end up running validators, as long as they have the option to, I think that will keep the costs low and will keep the system running well. Other questions? I'm out of time. All right, thank you very much.